Blair, you won't believe what I've found.
What is it?
I just can't believe it. I've found Charlemagne's mother.
His mother? Where?
Well, you remember we were just in Loon last year? That's Charlemagne's mom's hometown.
Wow, Loon is such an interesting ancient place.
You know, those statues in the fest hall must be of them, the mother and child, Charlemagne and his mother Bertrada. You remember way up on the top, they grace that building, and she's holding a torch, just like the Statue of Liberty.
And the animals up on that building, up high, next to her, guarding her.
Well, this validates our other information about Charlemagne. Paris is really the western edge of that arc between Paris and Prague that Charlemagne and his mother must have known so well.
Loon's been an important spot for probably thousands of years. It's on that volcanic spur that juts up out of the plain. You can see for miles in all directions. And it's right on the way between Paris and the east.
You know, I've always been intrigued with Loon, ever since I was first there with the kids, maybe 30 years ago. It's the most charming place, and
it's an important place, a very important place.
My husband Blair and I have been researching Celtic Europe. Since we've been grounded by the pandemic, I was reviewing materials I hadn't had the chance to process before. We'd had no inkling when we stayed in Loon that we were in Charlemagne's home territory. Loon is a magical place, sitting on a volcanic rise like a ship on the desert. The hall there pierces the sky. How can stones look so light and airy, like elaborate origami, folded into repeating rhythmic patterns of flying buttresses, arches, towers, with steep slate roofs? As you round the last corner going up the hill, the immense ship of a building whisks into view under full sail. Wide-eyed animals look out across the plains from soaring heights above the mother and child. Knowing that Charlemagne's mother's from Loon validates so much of our other information and solidifies the Paris-Prague connection. It makes perfect sense. Charlemagne was a Frank. Prague is in Pannonia. The Franks came from Pannonia. We've seen strong Frankish traces in the Rhineland and Belgium, but now Paris and Loon also come to the fore as Frankish. We'd like to begin our journey to Prague from here in Loon and make 7 stops in all, each providing wonderful insights into Charlemagne's 9th century world. Before we begin, let me share some hints we've found to be helpful. Celts usually group their favorite places together. If you see an abbey, look for a great hall, a refuge castle, thermal baths, public parks in the vicinity. We're convinced that abbeys were secular centers of learning and production, usually with vineyards and lodging. Women founded and led many early abbeys, but were excluded from the abbeys with the onset of Christianity. From what we've seen, women were excluded as part of a broader Christian treatment of women as inferiors. The abbeys turned male only when they were overtaken for religious purposes. The onset of Christianity and the exclusion of women go hand in hand because the treatment of women as inferiors is part of the Christian doctrine. This view of women is consistent with early Christian teachings of women as the gates of hell, responsible for original sin, and being driven out of the Garden of Eden. The basic concepts of abbeys fit into the Celtic ideals of family and nature. Many of Charlemagne's family members, both male and female, instituted abbeys. Subject matter encompassed by the abbeys included nature-based studies, winemaking, farming, horticulture. One more attribute that we associate with Celts to keep in mind as we go along our journey is the love of wine. Traces of wine have been found in various Iron Age excavations to the extent that shards of wine amphoras were used as construction fill. We'll look at some Celtic wine regions a little bit later. So we'll start in Loon, which is very close to Paris, Do you remember the last time when we were there? We were coming from the east. We had just been to Vauclair Abbey and had seen so many references to women in the fest halls and in the naming and in the forests. And when we came in, I remember that the street was full of umbrellas in a special art exhibit, and it was so festive and welcoming and seemed to herald the monumental importance of this little tiny place.
And then when we got to the fest hall, we started looking at the statues, and there were statues of men and women, many, many of them. But a striking feature was that many of the women were defaced, and not just scarred, but by defaced, I mean the faces had been chiseled off. You can remember that. That hadn't been the case with the men. And then you'd see women who'd lost their heads. You saw mothers who had their babies taken from their arms where they had been cradled.
And this is a strain that we've seen throughout, isn't it? Because babies wrenched from the mother's arms is still going on, and it's still a tactic of oppression and atrocity. Laon's proximity to Paris and the fact that Charlemagne's mother Bertrada is buried in Saint-Denis with other Merovingian and Carolingian leaders both add to its prominence historically. The horned bulls decorating the entry to the fest hall at Saint-Denis even bear intriguing resemblance to the ones at Laon. Closer into Paris from Laon sits Compiègne, another town where so many historical events have taken place. Additionally, once you reached Compiègne from Laon, you could ride the rest of the way to Paris through the red oak forest known as Rouvray. The only part of that forest remaining in Paris now is the Bois de Boulogne. The fest hall in Laon is a historical treasure chest. Joan of Arc stands with her flag there. Martin of Tours and his horse are also remembered in the hall. Martin came from Pannonia, from an area now in Slovenia, but is associated with the abbey at Tours on the Loire. European festivals still celebrate Martin on November 11th as the day that grape juice officially turns to wine. Martin also ties back to Paris with what is now a museum of scientific instruments and inventions. Although rebuilt, the tradition of a hall there dates back to the Merovingian era that followed the 5th century fall of Rome. So Kortrijk, Belgium, is the next stop after Laon. And the most important thing there to me is that Heroes' Hall, where Charlemagne is standing at the door as though he's greeting the people who are coming into that space. The reason that I consider this so amazingly important is that it's in the line of the Heroes' Halls that we were seeing in the Iron Age reconstructed villages, a place where you revere those who have fallen in your defense. And the beauty of this room, the red and gold that comes across, and the elegance of it, the arches, the panels rhythmically arranged all across that wall and wrapping around the next one. It was just monumental in my mind. It was one of the most stunning finds that we've ever made. What do you think about Kortrijk?
When you get to the center of the town, the old part of the town, there's a large square that's roughly triangular. That's where you'll find the bell tower. And just adjacent is the old city hall. And in that city hall, there is a council chamber that dates back 500 years or so. Very beautiful. It shows that there was some kind of representative government there for a long, long time. It's a very important place, steeped in history.
Aachen in Germany is our third stop. It's hugely significant because Charlemagne reputedly took his oath of office here in 800, and he's also buried here. Blair, say something about the baths, if you would.
The baths are extremely important in understanding Aachen. These are natural, thermal, hot water springs. There's more than 24 of them in the area. People have utilized these baths for thousands of years. We saw the chapel, the city hall, the adjacent marketplace, the medieval city around that. You can see that this was an important place and remains an important place.
Let me just add one little thought, Blair. Remember the pastries, because that pedestrian street is still so vital to everyone around there. Aachen, also known as Bad Aachen, is 150 miles east of Kortrijk. Ach likely derives from Celtic, later becoming Aqua, with en added to make it plural. It's been inhabited since the Neolithic era because of its hot springs. Early settlers could survive the winter by channeling the steaming hot waters. Neolithic inhabitants worked the flint mines here. Later, people mined coal. That early history carries through to Aachen's current science and technology institutes. Fest halls, abbeys, castles, thermal baths, and public parks. These were the favorite places for Celts, and Aachen has all of them. What's in a name? The castle here is called Frankenberg. Remember that Charlemagne was a member of the Frank family. The baths, 30 of them, indoor, outdoor, fabulous in Aachen, are Carolus Therma. Here I'd like to point out the many variations of Charles the Great. Whether it's spelled Karel or Carol or anything in between, look for Carolingian. We'll see another Karlsbad a little later. Walking along the paths in the vast system of parks that blanket the main area of town, you can come upon gravestones with Celtic insignias. And there's the family abbey connection here, too. Cornelie Münster was initiated by Charlemagne's son Louis. It shares with the Aachen Chapel the wonderful architectural feature of the high loggia at the top of the octagon. X marks the chapelle. Aix-la Chapelle, as it was known in French, was named after the town's key building. The word chapel may have come from hat, chapeau, chapelle. This tower really does look like a warrior's helmet. Inside, the domed octagon still looks like a jewel box, despite changes over the past 1,200 years. The Franks are identified as leaders of Aachen after the 5th century defeat of Rome, up through Charlemagne's 9th century era. The next stop is Prüm, which lies just south of Aachen. It feels as though it's a very remote spot. It is not in the middle of a bustling city. It's in the middle of a relatively small town. But the abbey itself is beautiful. It's decorated in gold. And there in the front, in an alcove, is the statue of a woman surrounded by a ring of stars. This may well be Charlemagne's grandmother, because his father and his father's mother, Bertrada, also the name of his mother, the father and the grandmother, founded the abbey there. In the inside is a fascinating sculpture because it shows a woman, head up, holding a column and calipers. Now, the Celts are very descriptive in what they portray in terms of naming places, and they want to give navigational information or information about a person. So having this woman holding the column and calipers, we take to mean she was probably the architect. We look for this combination of castle, thermal baths, fest hall, abbey. And there is that castle very close by. It's a beautiful castle sitting up on the hill, completely walled. Right near that castle is a very nice Gasthaus with terrace overlooking beautiful countryside there. When you go to Prüm, you have the feeling that it is a place that has served as a wonderful center of learning for a long time.
So an interesting place in a very interesting and convoluted part of the world, because the borders there have changed so often in so many ways. When I think of Trier, I think of its importance on so many levels. For one thing, it was the Roman headquarters for ruling Western Europe in the time of Constantine. This was the place where Constantine, then a general, was defeated and where he retreated from Western Europe, one of the events that led to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. He later went to Byzantium, where he ruled as Emperor Constantine. Both Worms and Trier were retaken at about the same time by the Celts. Worms, on the River Rhine, had been a seat of the Burgundian family, and the Burgundian family of Celts retook it. Trier, on the Mosel, was retaken by the Frankish Celts.
The Mosel and the Rhine, here we have them, two of the primary wine-growing regions in the world. Seems no accident that Worms and Trier were on these two very strategic, ancient, important sites. One thing that I also like to say about Trier, as difficult as it is to deal with this subject, the 16th century witch trials, and maybe the largest in Europe, took place here in Trier. Fulda, Würzburg, Bamberg, also in this general area, were sites for some of those most hideous of witch trials. And I think that's no accident either.
Also, Trier's geographic location makes it a prime hub in the trade routes of early Europe. It's on the Mosel River. It's also on land routes that go to the west. It's a hub between land and water routes for travel in those ancient days. Lorsch is one of the 4 abbeys founded by Charlemagne in the Odenwald region of Germany. It's about 15 miles east of Worms, and it's on the Rhine floodplain that surrounds Worms. This area is immensely important from an archaeological standpoint. Throughout, there are findings, archaeological findings, of Celtic settlements, Celtic farms, Celtic tools from the Iron Age that show that this was a rich, inhabited, well-populated place. At Lorsch itself, you can see a few buildings that have been restored or reconstructed, but I like to imagine what else was there back at the time of its heyday. Many more buildings, of course, but you can still see that this is a rich area. Farmlands still surround the abbey buildings. The nearby town is thriving, much as it would have been in Charlemagne's day.
One thing that I really loved seeing at that beautiful museum in Worms that was right next to the wall, you remember in that former abbey, Blair?
Yes.
They talked about milling of grain going on there 5,000 years before the current era. That to me is just amazing to think of how advanced these people were. The other thing that I love to think about with this abbey is that it was known for its scriptoria and library collections. I need to take a different tack here for a minute, because it was at this point in preparing for this presentation that I came upon the most remarkable finding. It has to do with the Codex Laurentius, which was from Lorsch, from Charlemagne's era. And in researching further about that, I came across this book cover, and Blair, I want you to look at it and tell me what you see.
This is a remarkable book cover because it's carved in ivory. It's got a number of figures on it. The most curious of them is a prominent figure of what appears to be a woman. But in addition to her feminine attributes, she's got a mustache and a beard.
What caught my eye at first was the horned animals, these charming animals that we've seen at Laon and Saint-Denis on the facades, and that same depiction is at the bottom of the cover. From following Bertrada and Charlemagne, we've seen them, mother and child, at Laon, And we know that Grandmother Bertrada is on the abbey at Prüm. These are all suppositions based on this family founding so many of these learning institutions. So in looking up further on the cover, I saw Charlemagne and his mother Bertrada, and who would that be on the other side? Of course, his whole family is involved in the founding of the abbey, so that must be Grandma and Grandpa. That must be the parents of Bertrada. So on the left is her dad. He looks fine, very Celtic with the arches and the intricacy and the beauty of the depiction of fabric. But on the right, Grandma looks like Grandma, except that when you look more closely, you be the judge, that's not just funny lighting, that's a mustache and beard. I would submit that the likelihood is that it was placed there much later, after the Christian conquest of Europe occurred, and again we're seeing the erasure of the woman's role in medieval Europe.
That could be. From the figure, she appears feminine. Her hip, her face, her feet, her hairdressing. That would be my guess.
Lorsch Abbey also ties to the famous heroic epic, the Nibelungenlied. Originally, I was taught that this was the first piece of German literature. Well, actually, we found at the museum that it was the Burgundian account of the battle against the Romans. And it tells of Siegfried's death by the Romans and his wife Kriemhild mounting a campaign to avenge her husband. Siegfried is buried at Lorsch. So it's just an amazing area rich with literary significance as well as historical significance. Karlovy Vary is a gem. I feel when I visit there that this really embodies still so much of the Charlemagne era, especially because it is a Frankish thermal well-being village that has everything you could imagine, and the beauty of it is absolutely stunning. There are very hot mineral baths here that could have sustained an extensive population over the winter months for a long time. And from the look of it, the mineral baths have played a central part in the activities of this village. There are esplanades, mineral water flowing freely out of the spigots that are with the pavilions. There are thermal baths in Karlovy Vary, beautiful gardens surrounding it, river walks, octagonal fest hall that is decorated more modernly, but it is that octagonal Carolingian fest hall that we've seen in Aachen as well. There is a museum with extensive information about the Celtic times, including a mock-up of the nearby castle right at Locket. And I would also recommend a visit to Locket because it's on a promontory that's looped by a river in a way that so many of the other castles also are located.
Karlovy Vary, a very interesting place. The older part of the town, the facades have the look of the late 19th century. So ornate buildings, hotels. The river Tepla runs down the center of this district of Karlovy Vary, and it evokes another age. When you go to the museum, you can see even earlier ages and in the clear evidence that this place has been occupied for thousands of years and that the waters of this area have been enjoyed for that period.
Two other things that I would point out. Karlovy Vary is Czech, Karlsbad is the German, and Carlsbad is a name that is repeated even in this country, which to me signifies the importance of keeping that name alive. One other aspect of Karlovy Vary that from a touristic standpoint is that along the river near the thermal baths are bazaars, stands where you can buy beautiful textiles, things of local interest and craft. So there too you have the memory of the medieval fairs.
Thanks for joining us on a short jaunt through Charlemagne's domain, places that were important in the Celtic world and today.
From Paris to Prague, through Lomme, native daughter Bertrada and her son Charlemagne. Kortrijk, Heroes' Hall, Charlemagne with quill and sword. Aachen, oath of office and final resting place. Prüm, Grandma Bertrada and Charlemagne's dad, the Count. Trier, Rome's downfall and the power of wine. Lorsch, libraries, fertility and the Nibelungenlied. Karlovy Vary, wintering at the thermals, the exquisite joy of architecture and parks. Blair, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and I would ask you, if you had the chance to go back to any one of these places, first and foremost, which would it be?
Probably Karlovy Vary.
Why?
Because of the romance, the baths, the whole town.
More.
The history, the setting, the liveliness, and the history.
We really appreciate your interest. Let's all go to Karlovy Vary, if only in our dreams. We love exploring the Celtic past with you. We've talked to so many of you. Your insights give us momentum and keep us digging further. We find it so exciting to think of the bustling, accomplished, wealthy world that we're seeing more and more through archaeology and through looking at these various places and their connections. Our hands reach those of our ancestors across the ages through family and stewardship of nature. They're two cornerstones. Thank you, and let's keep working together.
We welcome you to this journey. More and more of us are seeing the world through new eyes, discounting tales and myths of passed along for centuries, based on evidence. Thanks for joining us.